Hi, I'm Doyle.
And I'm Jordan, and I've got some things to say, and I kind of want to pick up a little bit from the last episode where we kind of started the conversation talking about the podcast and sort of the things that, um, some things we've kind of intentionally avoided, particularly with regards to politics. Um, and kind of what we want these conversations to be about, and it kind of went into this divergent conversation. I don't say divergent, maybe just kind of an aside conversation where we got into a little more of the details around some of those topics. And of course, as most of our conversations do, kind of spawn some ideas about other topics to talk about. And We've kind of broken the ice around talking a little bit politically, and I don't want to get into tit for tat sort of things, because I don't think that that's beneficial. And I think that that's the spirit of us attempting to avoid talking about politics and political things, and talking about things not just of a political nature but politically, is that you fall into this false dichotomy that has been constructed for people to believe one way or the other about. And we talked a little bit of the details around why we don't really like talking about that, and it's really everyone, I think, to some degree or another, is susceptible to falling into that kind of thinking, that kind of rhetoric, and you have to be very intentional so that you don't. But one of the topics that came up last time that definitely requires some unpacking, and I think, Doyle, you'd mentioned in the episode that you wanted to talk about this, and I 100% agree, because I think that it is a fundamental issue, is that around education, public education, certainly education generally, but also a little bit of this whole, kind of blackmail type situation that the federal government has the states in, where it's almost a de facto direct control that the federal government has over the states on certain behaviors, certain things, because they threaten to withhold Title IX funding, which is school funding, from the states, and the states depend upon and rely on that to a heavy degree. I mean, they're very addicted to that money supply, and even with that money supply, they certainly, I will go so far as to say, mismanage those funds. Even with or without those funds, they mismanage their operations. Let's just say, that leads into some serious issues, and I think that that requires and is worthy of some unpacking. Um, I think that there's a lot of history there that a lot of people are unaware of how just directly that has been a sort of boot on the neck or gun to the head or whatever, violent sounding metaphor you want to
Mm.
use, that really has been what the states have been under. um, but the states are no saints in this, right? They could stand up against it, but they
Mhm.
choose to take the easy way out and just capitulate. Anyway, that's kind of a preference, and that's, of course, a lot of my opinion in there, and a lot of editorializing in the delivery. But I mean, that's why you do a podcast. But Doyle, I want to turn it over to you and let you have some time to really talk about your perspective on a lot of that stuff, and maybe some of the more specific parts of it that you think are worthy of mentioning and discussing.
Sure. Thanks for that setup. I want to start by saying that my entire education, at least through elementary, secondary, and post secondary through the baccalaureate level, was all in a public education institutions. I went to public schools all the way through. Didn't go to kindergarten because back then kindergarten wasn't as prevalent and certainly wasn't mandatory, all the way through the 12th grade, graduated from a public high school, and then went to a state-sponsored, university, and got a 4-year degree. And then from there, I did ultimately end up getting my master's degree from a private university, but that was more out of convenience than philosophical. And so I've been very a strong supporter of the educational system and the quality of it for a long, long time. That has pretty significantly changed over the last several years. And quite frankly, I probably should say that my wife is went through the public education system as well as my two sons, and so we're speaking from a position. I'm speaking from a position of experience with the public education system. But one of the things that has really influenced and sort of significantly affected and changed my perspective on the public education system, first of all, has nothing to do with the quality of the people in the system. I think the people in the educational systems, by and large, the teachers and the administrators, especially at the local level, are have good hearts, and they have great intentions. But I think that what you mentioned, Jordan, is about the federal government getting involved through the Title IX funding, has sort of changed that whole perspective of how they operated. I recall in my years in the educational system that teachers tended to be able to teach the material. At least that was my experience. And they adapted their teaching methods to the students. I was fortunate enough to go to a very small school where all the teachers knew all the students and all the students knew all the teachers. And there's good and bad, right? I mean, if you mess up, they know it, and there's that quick communication path back to your parents. And that's because it was a small community-based school. Those have changed radically, and some of those changes were for good reasons. For the whole integration back in the '60s and the early '70s, I was in school during those years, and was involved in that as a student, and quite frankly, I think that was a good thing. I don't have anything bad to say about that, because my experiences through the integration process were all very, very positive, and I think it was a great social and cultural and community plus when that happened for the community that I grew up in. But what I did see, and it started happening, well, after I graduated from high school in the '70s, it started happening, shortly thereafter, once I got out of college, and the federal government, the influences began to be very, very obvious. And the first one is my first job out of college, when I graduated college, was working for the local educational system on a federal grant funding. And it was a position, the alcohol and drug counselor for the local high schools back in the day before they had the DARE program. It was an attempt to begin values clarification and building a positive influence, and an influence against the use of drugs and exposure and education about things and some of the risks. And it was funding that was only available for programs of that nature, and the local system took that. Well, you think, okay, that's a good thing, and it was a good thing. But what you alluded to, the restrictions and the control mechanisms began to start manifesting themselves over the years, to the point in time where a lot of the funding began to be tied to these standardized test results. And what I began to witness as a parent was the teaching methods began to change from teaching for learning to teaching for testing. And I think that's sort of uh, uh, significantly changed, in a not good way, the quality and the methods of teaching and education through the system, because it then became a rationalization and a justification for maintaining or getting more funding, rather than. Now, I know there are arguments that these tests, these standardized tests, are supposed to be measures of what is being learned, but my two sons, I witnessed that there were the whole series of weeks leading up to the standardized testing that happened throughout the schools at the same time, were to prepare the child for the test. Have them get good sleep and eat good meals and everything in preparation for the test. And those are not bad things; those are great things. But the emphasis was just around the testing time period, not across the whole school year. And it became very flipped, in my estimation, from what it was all about. And I didn't see a lot of kids that were learning the hunger for education. It became, quote unquote, a job that they had to go to, and they had to go do these things. Now, there were some that did well and had a hunger that was more of a natural. And I think something to add, and I'll pass the baton back to you in just a moment. One of the things that I think that this caused was, among other things, among other reasons for this outcome is parents began to become less involved with their children's education because it wasn't as much, didn't appear to be as much about learning as it was about the testing and preparing for the test needs. And the teachers were began to be measured by their test results. So when you want certain behavior, you measure it, and then you hold people accountable to those measurements, and then you'll get that behavior. And I think that's what's happened. That is what has happened, and now that's led to going to the next step, and that is the content, controlling the content of the education, which is where I think it really becomes a train wreck. And the only way, in my estimation, the only way for that to be corrected is for control to be back at the lowest level, and that it starts with the parents. I think the parents should have more control over the education, and in the local educational system, such as it might be, should have more control and influence on how their children are taught and the programs they have. And I got it that the federal government has the money, but that money belongs to the taxpayers. That money does not belong to the government, and that's what a lot of people seem to forget. So that's sort of in 1,000 words or less, sort of my broad brush view of the educational system. Jordan, what are your thoughts based on? I mean, you're in a different generation than I am, so you have I'm sure, a slightly different perspective, maybe even a significantly different perspective. And how do you think my perspective fits in with yours and/or differs, and especially the current state?
So first, I want to speak a little bit about some of the things that you said because I think you hit on some very important points, and I think the most deeply impactful overriding point is and this goes back to something that I talked a little bit about last time, and I talk about a lot. I've talked about in some of the videos that I've done over time, and it's such a fundamentally important topic, and that is people responding to incentives. That the teachers are given the incentive to have their students do well on these exams, and so humans are optimizing creatures. That's literally what we do. We try to optimize everything we do and be more efficient, more efficient. And when you do that, then you become myopic about these tests, and then everything revolves around these tests. And in fact, I was actually a teacher for a very short period of time. I taught mathematics, and it was painfully obvious to me in the extremely short period of time. We're talking a scale of months, right? And during that time, it was painfully obvious to me that not just were the teachers myopically focused on preparing for tests, everyone in that system was myopically focused on the tests because of the funding that goes with it. Not just the teachers keeping their jobs, but the districts are incented to have their students do well, so they get the funding, and thus they create incentives for their teachers to have their students do well, and thus the teachers create incentives for the students to do well, and so we get this real distortion in that way. I think another thing to call out with what you've said, and I think that this is almost equally important of a point, and I don't think that I've seen a lot of people speaking about this directly head on, and this is something that I think is very concerning to me, is the nature of these tests. And you'd mentioned that parents have become less interested in their children's education, and I think as a trend, I don't know that is in their heart what has happened. I think what has happened is that this focus on standardized testing has created a battery of useless ephemera in knowledge that the parents don't understand, they don't connect with, they don't know, because they don't need to, because it's not related to real life, and thus they
Right.
have no connection to what it is their kids are learning. And so then by nature they just like, well, you can learn this and go with the experts, quote unquote, and learn that from them. I don't know it, I can't help you a lot. So that because of the nature of these testings and the topics and things that are tested on, it's another way that parents and children are getting pried apart from each other, whether intentionally or unintentionally. It doesn't matter. It's what's actually happening. And
And the system too. The prying is the parents from the system, right? Because
sure, right,
you don't see the influence that parents used to have through PTAs. I mean, you rarely ever hear of anyone talk about a PTA anymore, except for doing the spring carnivals and fall, things of that sort,
right,
but
right.
not being involved in the system directly.
And so the third thing, and I think is the last thing I'll say about what you said before I speak a little bit more about my experience and perspective, is this whole idea of this Title IX funding being um, withheld from schools or used as, a carrot, you can say, although it's a little bit more than just a carrot, um,
Hmm.
is I don't think many people
24 carats, maybe.
understand. Yeah, I don't think people understand uh, just how large the scope is of what the federal government puts pressure on the states to do to get this funding, because it's not
Hmm.
just in the realm of education, it's all kinds of things. And one of the facts that I think, especially people my generation and younger, I think that almost none of them know, is that the federal government put pressure on the states to raise the drinking age to 21 across the country, and threatened them with funding for roads, funding for Title IX for schools, all this other stuff, and said that if you don't do this, you're not going to get this money. And
Hmm.
regardless of what you think about the drinking age, that's an irrelevant point. My point in saying that is that they will use this blackmail that they have in any way that possible. The federal government will, against the states, to make them do anything that they want them to do. And so that's
Hmm.
the real problem here, is that we don't have a federal government. We have a unity government where the federal government just basically tells the states what to do. Here's one thing, and this is a real aside. We can have another discussion on another time about this. But here's one aside that I think that is enheartening to me, where this is actually getting pushed back against, and that's in legalization of drugs, like
Oh yeah.
marijuana and stuff. Well, marijuana is still federally illegal, but there are many states in which it is actually legal and sold legally. The federal government has not yet decided to clamp down on that, and I think because of I, I have suspicion on why that is, because I think that if the federal government really wanted it to be illegal, they would just clamp down and say you're not going to get school funding if you did this. That's just what they would do, because that's what they have a history of doing. So I think ultimately the federal government doesn't care, and so they're just like letting things play out in the states until it gets mass acceptance, and then federally it will be decriminalized and then subsequently legalized, because that's the pattern that all these things go through. So that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. So that's really what you want to see, or you want to keep in mind if you're looking at things that are changing in society, is are there things that had been illegal for a while, that are becoming accepted in some way in society, and then is it becoming legalized or decriminalized, meaning you just get a fine misdemeanor for it, and then is it further becoming legalized at the state level, and if it's going through that process, is the federal government trying to clamp down on it by withholding this funding? If not, it's likely that the federal government eventually will allow that. You can also see that in things like same-sex marriage, that went through the exact same process.
Hmm.
Anyway, like I said, that's a real aside. So I think people really don't understand the extent to which the federal government holds the states to some degree hostage on these things. Although the state, again, I'll repeat, the states are not saints in this, because they have all ability to
Right.
say, go stuff the money. We're going to take care of ourselves. The thing is,
Hmm.
nobody wants to be the ones to do that, because too many voices are concerted together to ask for the handout, so to speak. Uh,
Hmm.
but it's hard. It's hard to criticize that too much. To your last point, because that money does already belong to the states. So the real problem with all of this whole rigmarole, isn't the systems that have sprung up. Those are problems. Don't get me wrong, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is this shuffling of money around, the taxation, right? That's the ultimate problem. But again, that's I've talked a lot about, or some about that in the past, and I'm sure I'll talk a lot about that in the future. But let me ratchet back to the topic at hand, because I think that it's important to do so. Um, my experience with the school system is very much of the nature. So, to reiterate my background, and just because I think that it's pertinent to understand this information, I was a good student. I was a very good student, and I didn't hate school, but I didn't love school. There was a lot about it that I did hate. Right, I hated the like prison type nature of it. That I really felt like that I just couldn't. I wasn't living life. I was just doing whatever. And not only that, I felt so restricted, because the things that I did love about school and learning about, especially like mathematics, I was so uh, held back in that desire to learn, and I wanted
Hmm.
to learn it all right now. And very likely I had the capacity to do that. I know I'm rare in that, but I'm not uncommon in the people who have the capacity to want to just sponge it all in and learn it, that are held back because of this, lockstep. You have to
Yeah.
go with people your same age.
Well, there's a practice, and I won't call it a principle because and maybe it is a principle that basically contributes strongly to that, and that is they teach to the average,
Sure.
right? And
Well,
that goes to the metrics,
it's
right? They
deeper than
don't
that.
want to.
And this goes more to my perspective on it. It's deeper than that, because if you look at the whole school system, the way that it is, the whole reason, like in the 1800s, that it was even instituted was to make good factory workers. That's why there's a bell system. That's why people walk in lines everywhere. That's why things are so structured and rigorous, because it was to teach kids who may have only been farming and stuff up to that point, the ability to work in a structured system, to be able to go into factory work, because that was going to be what life was. Because it was, they went over to Prussia and really saw, like that Eastern Europe rigor, and brought that
Mhm.
back here. And that's not what life's like these days at all, especially in the United States. That's not the average. Even talking about teaching to the average, this is why I disagree. You're right about that, but I think that that's not, if they taught to the average of what real life was today, like, not just to the average student, but to the average outcome, then they wouldn't even be doing what they're doing now with teaching. I feel very
Right.
confident. And so there's a very, uh, almost non existent feedback loop between the reality of the market, real life, real jobs, all that, and what is taught and how it is taught. The feedback loop that is there is not from practicality, it's from ideology. And this, going back to like the whole Jordan Peterson thing, that's the problem that we're seeing right now, is that you have the fundamentals of actually living real life and being a, successful human being, and successful even just to the extent of you're able to support yourself and your family, are the echoes from real life back into education that are required for that education to be successful are non-existent on that side. But on the side of ideology and, um, things that are not necessarily irrelevant or not necessary, some of it is, some of it's very relevant, some of it's very necessary, but not all of it is. But that all echoes almost immediately back, right? And
Mhm.
it's this, again, incentives that people respond to, is that with social media, with the way things are in the news, etc., people are, this idea, that they need to adopt these views that they don't even themselves hold, because they have to expand their horizons, this, that, and the other, whatever reasons are given for it. uh, it's good to be exposed to things, sure, but to say that you must think this way, that you must feel this way about it, that's what, the danger of things that are filtering back into, the education system, that I think that are really bad.
Mhm.
Because not only is it just a, uh, teaching you in school thing, it's a, you're a bad person if you don't do this. So it's moralizing
Mhm.
in school. That's what's really got me upset about a lot of this stuff, because kids are really smart. And I'm continually surprised when I talk to, and not just kids, but even just young adults, like, 18 to like 22, and see, where their mindset is about things. There's a lot of them that buy everything that's put in front of them, hook, line, and sinker, and it's
Sure.
like they're just going to be a kind of a automaton robot, of the system in that way. There's a lot of people like that, but there's a lot of people that understand that they're getting shoveled a whole bunch of crap, and,
Mhm.
they may not know what there is beyond that, and that's the real
Right.
problem, is that the crap that they're shoveled, and I'm not saying that it's all crap, that's not my point. My point is that there is some crap that's being
Mhm.
shoveled, but because of that crap that's being shoveled, it's blinding them to a degree, to what actually is out there from an understanding perspective, right? Philosophy is not taught in schools, to the detriment of humanity. Philosophy is not taught in schools, any philosophy, like even basic philosophy, just to know about it. Um, and so that goes to your point about the whole not teaching thinking things. And I think that, there's a lot of interest that want those thinkingless automatons to come out of this system.
Sure.
And, that combined with the idea that, again, to your point, that education is not controlled by the parents. almost at all, unless you're well off enough to be able to send your kid to private school, and you have private schools that are of sufficient quality around you to choose from. Uh, and there aren't other restrictions stopping you from that, because there are some in some places. Um,
Sure.
the parent is kind of up the creek without a paddle, and it's the child is the parents. The child's not the states. The child's not the schools.
Right.
And the state and the school act like that child is theirs and is it's a product of them and is their property, is their chattel, really.
Right. Right.
And it's like, that's so weird, because like, of course the state kind of acts like that to adults, but at least adults are adults, right? And they can try to fend for themselves. A kid, what you are molding that kid to be something by going through this process, this rigorous of a process, this deep of a process, at a point in their life where they're just forming themselves. It's really scary what you can cause a child to be by having that kind of influence over their development. And thus, I think that we need to figure out a way to immediately, I won't say eradicate the system, but shift the control from the government into the parents' hands.
Well, something we haven't mentioned, but I think is something worth bringing up, is that there has been quite the proliferation, and maybe that's too strong of a word, but at least some significant expansion of homeschooling,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And as parents intentionally elect and choose to homeschool, and sometimes they're maybe ill-equipped, sometimes they may be extremely equipped, but there are supportive and supporting um, agencies that kind of help. And so there's been
Uh,
a lot. I mean, even in my sphere of a community, I know of a number of families that have elected to homeschool their children, from all the way through, K through 12, and then have them choose what next step they want to do and go with in their life.
Well,
I
I want
think
to
that's
interject for a second, because you said
sure,
something that I don't know that I agree with. You said the
okay,
parent is ill-equipped to school their child. What does that mean? Who decides
sure.
the ill-equipping of the parent?
And I didn't mean that from the standpoint of some external regulatory ill-equipping. What I was talking about is, maybe they didn't have a very deep education themselves. Maybe they, were an average student by some metric. What I'm getting at is maybe they don't feel prepared or equipped or competent, but they're serious enough about their child's education that they want to be the ones controlling it. I
Then
didn't
I
mean
then
that
then
they shouldn't be.
I want to make a distinction here. And this, it may seem petty that I want to do this, but
Sure.
I think that this is super important. That parent is then thus not ill-equipped. Any parent who's taking active, intentional thought in a role in their child's education is ultimately equipped to be able to provide the education for that child. Now, they may not be the ones providing that education directly, but I think using the language that parent is ill-equipped is dangerous, because that's the kind of hook that somebody with ill intention will grab onto to say, well, no, I needed to take control of what your child's educated. Because if you're ill-equipped, then how do you even know what the child needs to be educated about? I think the parent is the ultimate well-equipped person, especially the parent who's trying to take active role in making sure that their child has a good education,
Mhm.
whether by them or
Right.
by someone that I think that they hire, or however they do it. I think that
Yeah.
is it. We need to uphold that, and we need to praise that, and we don't need to use words that can be used by other people to be twisted to make it seem like they don't know what they're doing.
Sure. And absolutely, your point's spot on, and I agree with it, and agree with the need for specific and specificity of languages and terms. My only intention was to say from the parent's
And
perspective,
I know
they
how
may
you,
not
you
feel
feel
like
about this, so
a
I'm
professional
not trying
educator.
to rail you. So I only say that
No, I
because
get
for
it.
clarity for the audience.
We're putting something out, and you want to make sure that the correct message is framed and leaves little to no room for misinterpretation.
Correct.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was my perspective was, from the individual perspective of the parent, that they may feel unqualified to do it. But the fact that they are actually moving forward with it, I think, is, to your point, it shows them to be equipped or appropriate or qualified to guide the education. And I think, and it is their authority, within their authority, right?
Oh yeah.
People think that going to public school is mandatory, and with the laws, it's not. It's mandatory. I think the law says it's mandatory that they get an appropriate education, but there are multiple ways that can be done and appropriately and sufficiently to meet the legislative and the regulatory aspects of it, which of course is another topic about whether that should be required or not. But the whole thing there, though, is that I was trying to get at is that is an avenue or a path or a sub solution to some of the ills that we talked about in the federal government and the leverage. Here's the sad part: these parents that are homeschooling their children, they're still paying the same taxes as everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get a credit because they're doing it themselves.
Well, the same when you go to send it to private school, right?
Right. Sure. Absolutely. And I think this sort of, and don't want to go down the path right now of talking about school vouchers, but I think an even better solution is optional taxes on something like that, right? So that you can choose to participate or not. Which the thing is the government taxes takes the money, and then they use that money for control and leverage, which is what we're we part and parcel of a big part of our point here. So you had said something that led me to mention about the homeschooling, that it's going to need some sort of a massive change, and that wasn't your term, but I mean I think a significant change in the system. And the thing that I want to go back to, I think the system is the problem, not all the people, and that's the sad part. A lot of the people, the participants, the teachers and administrators, basically are pawns and victims of the system that's been put in place, right? Because I think most people that go into
I don't think they're a
teaching,
victim. I don't think they're a victim, because the thing is, like, you have the ability to understand what's going on and to look into things, and so when you choose voluntarily to go into something, you take on the responsibility of whatever the consequences of that are, unless it is egregious. And I don't think egregious to the extent of like abuse, and I don't think that the system abuses the teachers per se. Now, maybe some people in the system abuse the teachers, like on one-off or maybe even a small scale sort of a way, but I think en masse it's not abuse, because it's like it almost by definition can't be abuse that this many people would come into a system voluntarily.
Well, yeah, your point, your point makes good sense. But when you think in terms of, and this goes to something we've talked about before too, people not thinking for themselves, right? And they become these automatons.
Yeah, sure, but they must still take responsibility for themselves as an adult.
Absolutely, fair point. And maybe victim is not the word.
Yeah, that's my only point.
They're
not victim.
They are ignorant participants.
Yeah,
some are ignorant participants, right? They just don't know, right?
Correct.
I don't mean they're stupid. I don't mean that.
Nescient. They're nescient. There's a difference. There's the word
Right.
ignorance, and then there's nescience. Ignorance is but you ignore. Nescience is I just never knew.
And so that's what I was referring to, those, when I used the term victim, because they have in their minds and hearts what they thought were pure and honorable objectives and values about it, but they didn't get past the surface to understand. Some do, right? That's why you see a lot of them leaving public education and going into private education, because there's a lot more control on the whole system and the whole processes and the principles under which, and the values too, right? I mean, that's a problem that we're seeing now more than I think in past generations. That there are values-based differences, that are taught, and because of all other financial pressures, that the local governments sort of capitulate to these other values, and you mentioned this too, the values that are taught that kind of go against social mores or social values of the local community.
Right.
And again, that goes to something that you mentioned earlier last time about, you can't see how, a group of more than 12, you're saying a very small group can reflect all the values of the group, completely, right? Because there's so many different ways of looking at things, and that just multiplies and exacerbates the situation, in my estimation, to a great extent, and even amplifies your point that it's going to require something major and significant, shifting and changing, and it can only come from the bottom up, because
Yeah.
the system has way too much inertia, has way too much power, money, translate that as money, and too much
Not just money
objective.
though. It's also to the point that you had mentioned a second ago. Regulation of curriculum and like the
Right.
topics that are taught. I mean, that's a don't let's not forget how important that is.
Sure, absolutely, and the things that aren't taught, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the way that they're taught in, framed, and how they're taught, the narrative and the stories, by which they're delivered, right? With a mission and objective, rather than, knowledge and education. It's to shift, and
Well,
you
and
made a statement
this
a
is,
moment.
and this is again an aside, but something that I really believe in every day that I live. I believe it more. Um, Education is not something that you can get from somebody else. Education is something you must do for yourself always.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that I think is the crux of what so many people miss about the system. I think there are many teachers that don't understand that. I think most
Yeah.
students don't understand that. I think most parents don't understand that. I think most administrators don't understand that. And it's like no, it's again passing the buck. People don't want to take responsibility for their own education,
Yes.
and combined with some people having the whole and this is almost pejorative. It is pejorative, but I'm going to say it anyway. A whole
Mhm.
think about the kids attitude, right? It's like yes, we should definitely think about the children, and we should try to help the children who are in need that we can help, but we should not force the parents to give us their children to help them. And
Right.
I think a lot of this is that people don't realize that education is you don't learn something until you do it yourself, until you learn it yourself, until you go through it yourself. Period. And I mean, you can remember facts, but just
Mhm.
knowing facts isn't as usually a sufficient way to make your way through life. Although there are a
Right.
lot of people who try to do that. Um,
That reminds me of the video that I did, on my personal channel, a few weeks ago, where I quoted Socrates. He said, "The best decisions are not based on facts, but on knowledge."
sure.
And there's a tremendous amount of truth in that, and I think you hit it, head on. That people learn and remember facts, but that without a context, that without an application, that without a personal experience, is nothing more than a list of numbers, or truths, or statistics,
Right.
right? They in and of themselves, and I should pull truth out of that, because that's very different than those others. But it's just a measurement. It's just a number. It's just a statistic, and they don't do anything but exist.
Right.
Right? They don't draw any values. They don't draw any conclusions. They don't draw any social application. They don't draw any any scientific application, whatever. That's where the knowledge comes in, and to your point, I think that's, apropos, is education. That's where education comes in, is when those things have a context and have an experience, and the wisdom that comes from and knowledge that comes from those, experiences and firsthand, connection with facts and,
And
and things that
and
are learned.
and having that intake from that knowledge, from that experience, from multiple sources, right?
Yes.
Your own experience for sure, if that's possible. But if it's not possible, multiple different people who have different perspectives, different life paths, different everything, different contexts that they're coming to it from, what they say about it. And then you have to take all of that and then kind of abstract some commonality across it.
Yeah.
And that's difficult, and understandably
Sure.
that's difficult. And so we want to optimize. Again, humans are creatures of optimization. We want to optimize that and make it efficient to uh, understand, but we can only do that so far at scale. scale is the problem, right? Scale is
Hmm.
really the
Hmm.
problem because like at some point it's going to become so impersonal that um what's the word? I
Becomes
forces and
you know,
people who don't have intentions and goals aligned with yours will be the ones to dictate what you are or aren't doing. That's the problem. Um, I mean that's maybe the ultimate problem with everything, but that's what happens, right?
mhm.
And it's rough, man. I want to go back, if you don't mind, to
Sure.
a couple things that I meant to mention. One I meant to mention earlier, and something you said kind of scratched my brain about it. You'd mentioned about school vouchers, which
Hmm.
for those of you not aware, the school voucher idea is that you're paying taxes. Some of those taxes are for schools. Well, then what we'll do is we'll kind of instead of making you go to the school that you're in the district of, we'll give you credit, basically, a voucher of credit for that much money that you paid the taxes for that you can go and use wherever you want. Maybe there's public schools that you can redeem it at. Maybe there's private schools and that you can redeem it there. And then those private schools take that voucher and give it to the government. Government gives them the money that's
Hmm.
equivalent to that voucher. So the idea there is to be able to port the money that you pay for taxes for schools anywhere for schools that can take those vouchers. I think on the surface it's a better idea than what we have, but I think the real problem then is that, who administers the voucher system and who says who can accept those vouchers and who can redeem those vouchers to the government for the money? That's going to be a problem because like if you have like a very like if you have a parent who wants to send their child to a very unconventional school because like they have very unconventional ideas, that's totally fine. That is a totally fine situation for a parent to send their kid to an unconventional school because like I think like unschooling stuff like that, right? I don't know
Hmm.
if you've heard about that unschooling. I won't go into it, but suffice to say, Google the term unschooling and you'll find a lot about it. Um, well, what if the federal government says, well, no, we're not going to give the money for the voucher to an unschooling system or unschooling parents who are unschooling, even, right? Because that's the whole idea is that
Hmm.
even if you're homeschooling, you could get the money directly
Sure.
from the government. And what they say,
Mhm.
we'll do anywhere but homeschooling. It's like any of this kind of stuff. You're just shifting the control mechanism. You're not really making things better. The way that you make things
Right.
better is that you pull it out of the system. Um, I really think what you have to do is uh, uh, stop taxing for schools. But then there's still a problem there too. Well, who decides how much of that tax was actually for schools? You can look and see
Mhm.
where they maybe earmarked it for schools or however they do that and separate that money. But they're just going to say, well, we don't do that much anymore. Here you get half of that amount. And it's like
Mhm.
it's just going to be another control mechanism. It's really problematic, and pulling it out is going to be really problematic. And then there's the flip side of that. The people are going to say, well, you're going to get money, but the only place you're going to be able to afford going to school is public schools. Um, and I think that in a real free market, would not be true. But the problem is that it's not going to really be a free market. There's a lot of discussion to be around that. So it's a real complicated, tangled issue.
It
To
is.
be
It is.
honest, but it's
And
it's
go ahead.
almost entropic, but you
Right.
get the point.
You made a comment earlier about where the origin around the origin of the organized, educational system came out of the 1800s and sort of what's sort of a primary, if not formally stated, certainly a de facto purpose was to prepare, people to work in factories, right? And the rigidity of schedule and things of that sort. You know, but people when they think of the educational system, they think, well, that it has existed forever,
Right.
right? It is sacrosanct. It is, untouchable. It's something we can't choose to dismantle. We can't choose to, radically revolutionize how we do this. And I'm using generalizations. Not everybody thinks that way, but behavior may, leads people to sort of perceive that that's the perspective they have about it. But when you take a step back and look and go, it's only been around for some limited number of generations. Prior to that, people got educated.
Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't as formal as as we like to think that it is now. I question if people are still getting educated very well. through that educational system. They're getting herded through the system.
Well, I mean, you got to
They're
think
getting
about what is the point of education? Like, what is the point of education?
Mhm. Right now, it's to get pieces of paper in
No,
their
no,
hands
no,
at
no, 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 no,
graduation.
no, no, no. I mean, generally, not
Well,
what. How does it
I know the real
play
fun.
out? What is the
Yeah,
point of education? The point of education is
right.
so that you can live a successful life, so that you know what you need to know to be able to function as a human being, as a member of society. Um, and the reality is, we're so advanced as a species now. That bar is really low. That bar is really, really low, right? There's some people
Mhm.
who can't because of psychological reasons,
Sure.
mental reasons, and we need to figure out how.
Physiological, right.
Right, we need to figure out how we can take care of those people. Absolutely, that's a completely separate issue. But for everybody
Mhm.
who's capable, that bar is really, really low. I mean,
Right.
stupidly low. Like, oh, that was a poor choice of adverb, but it's actually ironically apropos or interestingly apropos. It
Right.
is very low. You don't have to have a whole lot of education. You don't have to have a whole lot of knowledge. You don't have to be in any way particularly intelligent to be able to function in society right now. Now, I know that there's going to be a lot of people that argue about poverty and this, that, and the other. And it's yes, that exists. Yes, that's a problem. Yes, we need to do things to help address that. And the way that we do that is not by handouts and all that kind of stuff. It's again, this goes back to something I've said in a previous episode. It's not by having a system that takes care of all the individuals. It's about having a system that helps build up all the individuals to be strong enough to take care of themselves and those around them. Because we need
Mhm.
those
Mhm.
pillars, right? We have to keep building everybody as a pillar to support everything or to
Right.
support themselves and they're part of the everything. And then if everybody's
Right.
supporting their part of the everything, then we'll have the strongest superstructure you can imagine. Because that's the way
Right.
that that's the whole idea of the Enlightenment in Western Western philosophy just generally is that that's possible, right? We can have we can understand these things about life that will allow us to build ourselves strong and to stand for ourselves, our family, and those around us in a way that if we all do that, it's a much better society. Um, so man, I've gone on a real big tangent. I'm trying to remember back where where I started this, but I think the bar is really low for that, and we've definitely got to help those that still are struggling to go past that bar, no doubt about it. Um, but as that relates to education, there's not a whole lot you need to know, especially with the advent of computers and social media and things like that. That's pushed that even lower, right? Because like, yeah, you need to know a
Mhm.
little bit about math, but you don't need to know anything nearly about math now, like maybe you needed to 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, right? Where like 3 decades ago, let's say, you really wanted to know a good bit about math if you wanted to go into any kind of an office setting. But you don't really need to now. Because I mean, you've got spreadsheets, you got calculators, you got all kinds of software that will do all kinds of
Software. Yep.
specific calculations for you.
Right.
All you need to know is what it represents, right? So again, we're abstracting. All you need to know is kind of the ideas and how that idea translates into a little bit of the lower level practicality of it.
Right.
And that doesn't take a whole lot of education, right? And in fact, a lot of that is very specific kinds of education that can be done in a very condensed way. So much so that most jobs expect you to know basically nothing when you come in, and they teach you everything you
Right.
know. And as long as you have
Right.
that capacity to learn, then you're fine. And in fact, that's the way that it was with my career in software development. I knew nothing about software development when I started, and my boss at the time, he's like, to me, your degree doesn't mean anything. It just means that you can show up on time for a test, basically. And it's
Mhm.
like, and that means something. Don't get me wrong. That certainly means something
Mhm.
because, especially in the context of work, you need to be able to show up on time. You need to be able to be diligent about doing the work. But from there, like I came in knowing nothing and having aptitude, and learned very quickly because I had pretty high aptitude and enjoyed what I was doing. And so you learn faster when you enjoy what you're doing and was
Mhm.
able to function. I was on a significant project within 2 weeks of me, probably less than that, of me being at this place, because one, they had a pretty good idea of how to instruct people along this path of learning to get up and running, and two, because like I said, I had the interest, I had higher than average aptitude. But that's the way I think, in my experience, a lot of places are. Like, even if you go to school for something specific, like mechanical engineering, you go into an engineering firm, you're not going to be doing exactly what you learned in school day one. You're going to be learning how that business runs. You're going to be learning about their projects. You're going to be learning about how they do their projects, what their process is around the different tasks that need to be done. So you have to learn a lot of specific things when you go to work for an organization that you will never be able to learn in any sort of formal education environment. And so
Yeah,
I,
and
I
even if
think
it
that
was
that's a very understated in society right now.
sure, and even if the education was geared toward one specific company, one specific type of usage of that information, that knowledge, if you were to switch to somewhere else, it might not be relevant.
Correct.
And that leads me to what you're saying, that the bar is low, and people go, "Gosh, we're setting a lower bar on what we expect out of education." No, not at all. It's what's expected across the board. Then what's needed specifically and individually, that's where you can go deep or high, whichever the metaphor you want to use. Like what you said, you get on the job training, you get a specific knowledge on what you're being asked to do, and then as the person chooses, like what you mentioned when you got into software, you have someone has a particular aptitude for something and a desire and an interest. They will learn more on their own that they can then come and apply. But
They
it's more
will go. They
targeted.
will have actual education. That's my point.
Right. Right. Well, as we went back, mentioned earlier about the facts, or the things that they can remember, now become knowledge because they apply them, because
Yeah.
they use them. They have firsthand, experience with that knowledge that they've, or with those facts and those pieces of data that they've remembered,
And
that
one thing
they've
that
been
I'll say,
exposed
and
to.
this is maybe a little me being a little cheeky, but I'll say it. You're saying we need to lower the bar for education? Yeah, definitely we do, because we need to get people to be able to be in the real world earlier, to be able to function earlier, to be able to make society even better. Because we can. We've proven that we can. And what we're doing is we're retarding our growth as a species by making kids go in circles for however many years. And that's what it was. I guarantee you, I've learned the same dang things so many different years in a row, learned in a row
Mhm.
in the school system, that it makes no sense. And I know that you got to reiterate for people who don't pick it up. Sure, absolutely, that's fine. That's fine for them. Let's unlock everybody to where they need to be. You need
Right.
individualized education. You talk to any teacher who's like a real true from the heart teacher, they will tell you that they know that they need an IEP, individual education plan, which is what you normally do for somebody who has special education. But they understand the applicability of that to all students, and that how beneficial that would be for all students. It's just that doesn't scale. But guess what? It could scale if we could unlock the system to be at a real marketplace of need service, the way that almost all other marketplaces are, in this most important place. It's like, don't you want the system that gives you the best solution for the least cost in the most important place in education? If you think education is important, of course you would,
Mhm.
right? Well, why do you allow
Mhm.
it for like makeup, or like beard products, or like musical instruments? Like, you allow it for all of
Right.
that, right? Which is
Yep.
and those are important things too, don't get me wrong. But I mean, are they as important as education? Maybe they are, depending on who you are. But many people would say it's not. Education is more important. Great. Why don't we have
Sure.
that kind of a system that allows for that competition, that allows for that increase in level of service and decrease in cost, rather than
Two
artificially
reasons.
keeping it? Oh, I know why, but I'm just saying.
Right.
But go ahead. What were
Which
you going to
goes
say?
back to the beginning, going back to the beginning of this conversation.
It's
When I
control.
mentioned about the standardized testing and the financials, right? Those two things are the incentive, or the roadblock to
Yeah.
doing what you described.
Yeah.
And so we have to figure out a way to decompose those, or destruct those, in such a way that permits the actual progress that would be needed for that type of an educational solution set.
The good thing is,
Which
and oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I for one would love to see, and and I feel like a lot of people that would hear me say this are saying that I'm being disrespectful to the people that were part of my educational process, and in no way do I mean to do that. There's some, I encountered some wonderful people in the educational system through my years, and I also encountered a few that should have been in a different career,
Agreed. Same.
and I'll leave that at that. But that doesn't. I don't think that's the case. My points are all about the system.
Right.
And when I say the system, I'm talking about what we've talked about, the control or the federal government who has the least insight, to what any individual child needs. They wield the greatest control, and they wield the greatest control through regulations, but also through finances, and then the financials. And then what the system and the local entities do is they subscribe, if you will, to the standardized testing, because that's the lever that they have to control the amount of funding or the degree of funding that they get.
And it's easier to
And
do. It's a lazy way out because we can put it into computers and the
sure,
computer can figure it out for us. That's
right.
really, I think, insidious. One thing that I will say, and I think we probably need to wrap up here pretty soon. But one thing that I want to say is, I do not believe that systemically education cares about preparing children for the real world at all. And I have proof. Here's my proof. Where and when ever do we teach all kids how to pay taxes? When
Right.
and wherever do we teach all kids about finance and how to manage your money? When and where do we teach kids about what money actually is? When and where do we ever teach kids about how to provide value for compensation so that you can survive as a human? Where and when do we teach kids that all these things are necessary for a productive, successful life? We don't ever anywhere,
That's
and
absolutely right.
it
Yep.
is taboo to even bring up such a thing. That is ridiculous. We could burn down everything else about education that it is and only taught those things, and we would be more successful at creating well integrated humans into society.
Absolutely. And integrated and equipped,
Right.
humans. No question about
That
that. I fully agree
were
with that.
independent and would be much more free thinking than the society we have right now.
Sure, but again, that's not the objective of the machinery and
Of course.
the system that is
Because
named
everybody
itself
thinks
the
that they know
educational system.
better what somebody else should be doing. And that's
Right.
really what it comes down to. And a lot of it comes from a great place. And I want to ratchet back to a positive note. It comes from a great place because many of these people care so deeply. And I do
Absolutely.
too. And I think
Sure.
the fundamental difference of our perspectives on things is okay. Just don't force me to adopt your perspective, and I won't force you to adopt my perspective. That is my
Absolutely.
position.
Isn't that a very liberal attitude? I mean, from the
Yes.
standpoint of the truest sense of being liberal,
Yes,
that
absolutely.
and so I think it's been, a lot of words have been misappropriated in that regard. So, and I think anyone on the entire spectrum of philosophical beliefs like that should be willing to at least entertain, and if you want to do what you want to do, great, that's fine. Let me do what I want to do, and then we'll find peace and agreement in that, even though we have things that we don't agree, which is great. I'm fine with that as well.
This is the only way we'll find peace is to understand that there are differences among us and accept those allow for those differences among us. If we
Indeed.
don't, when we try to homogenize things, that's when we get real problems. And I think people have been deceived into not understanding that many of the things that the government does is an attempt, whether directly or obliquely, at homogenization for
Yeah,
efficiency,
agreed.
and that's the problem. But guess what? You wanna take that to the extreme? That's exactly what communism is. Eventually, that's
Hmm.
where you're gonna get when you try to homogenize and optimize.
Well, all right, sir. This was a good discussion. I mean, I feel somewhat of a catharsis experience through this discussion, because I've had strong points of view about the state of the educational system, and my concern is that um, they be constructive, and I
Yeah.
feel very much like we represented very constructive perspectives, critical but constructive. And I feel good about what we've discussed today, and I would love to continue, further digging into this topic among some of the others that we broached as well. I mean, the whole
Yeah.
thing of vouchers and local control and parental involvement and control. There's a lot of opportunity for us to share some of our thinking in those topics as
I
well.
got a quick
So-
quick coda for you here, a little post-credit scene thing that maybe we can use
Okay.
to inspire a subsequent conversation on the education system. And this goes to the point that you made early on about how after you graduated college, about 1980 or so, that the
Mhm.
system really changed to be focused on standardized tests, this, that, and the other. Well, you know what happened in 1980 that made that happen?
What happened in 1980?
The creation of the Department of Education.
Is that right?
Yep,
I
1980.
did not know that. Did not remember that. That speaks a lot. Speaks loudly, doesn't it?
Yep. So
Well, there's another topic, and I'm gonna go ahead and put it out there. When the government gets involved, it never improves.
it's the
Let me just leave that.
I think you've probably said this before. It's the Ronald Reagan quote. The sentence you could ever hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
Right, right. The oxymoron or the paradoxical statement. Yeah. All
All
right,
right,
sir.
good time, Noel.
It's
I
been a pleasure.
appreciate you taking some time to speak with me here and hearing me rant.
Yeah. Oh, no problem. It's we do have slightly different views in certain things, but I think some of that's generational. But from a philosophical perspective, I think we have a lot of parallels, and at least on the intent,
Yeah.
and that also full agreement that what's there now ain't working,
Yes.
or at least not working as it should. It's working in limited cases, but it could work infinitely better. No
Certainly.
question about it.
All
All right,
right.
sir. Good day to you.
You as well. And we will talk to you next time.